I'm a 28-year-old guy, and up until recently, I had little to no contact with my extended family. That all changed when I received an invitation to a family reunion out of the blue. It was weird, considering I hadn't spoken to most of them in years. Even weirder, the reunion was scheduled for the exact day of my birthday, a birthday they had never acknowledged before. To say I was skeptical would be an understatement. My family and I had a complicated history, and by complicated, I mean outright toxic. Things went downhill after my dad passed away. He left me his house, and a significant amount of money, and that didn't sit well with my relatives. My uncles, aunts, and cousins felt entitled to a cut, even though my dad made his wishes very clear in his will. They tried everything: guilt-tripping, legal threats, manipulation, but in the end, they got what my father intended, which wasn't much. The last time I saw most of them was right after the funeral, where they were already whispering about how unfair it was that I got so much. So yeah, when I saw that invitation, my first instinct was to ignore it. I had no reason to believe they suddenly wanted to reconcile, especially with the inheritance issue still looming over us like a dark cloud. But my mom, who was the only family member I still talked to, urged me to go. She claimed my uncles and aunts wanted to make amends, but there was hesitation in her voice. I could tell she wasn't completely convinced, almost like she was repeating something she had been told to say. I wasn't buying it, but she was persistent. She kept saying things like, they regret how they handled things, and maybe it's time for a fresh start. My girlfriend, on the other hand, wasn't convinced at all. She had been around long enough to see how manipulative my family could be, and she straight up told me it was a bad idea. And honestly, I agreed with her. But there was this nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, my mom was right. Maybe they did want to fix things. Maybe I was being too paranoid. So I decided I'd go, but on my terms. I wasn't walking into this alone. My best friend, who also happened to be a lawyer, was coming with me. Officially, he was my plus one. Unofficially, he was there to make sure I didn't get tricked into anything shady. Given my family's history, I wouldn't put it past them to try something underhanded. When we arrived at the reunion, I was instantly suspicious. The warm welcome was way over the top. Smiles, hugs, exaggerated excitement. They were treating me like I was the long-lost favorite son of the family. My aunts and uncles were suddenly reminiscing about my childhood, bringing up old stories about how close we all used to be. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were acting like we had some deep, unbreakable bond. It was weird. Too weird. I had walked in expecting cold politeness or even passive-aggressive jabs. Instead, I got the full VIP treatment. At first, I played along. I let them talk. I nodded and smiled, but the more they laid it on, the more obvious it became that something was off. They kept emphasizing how family sticks together and how forgiveness is important. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the idea that at the end of the day, family is all we have. If they were trying to be subtle, they were failing miserably. Dinner rolled around, and that's when the atmosphere started shifting. The warmth was still there, but something felt orchestrated, like the whole night was leading up to something. I caught my uncle whispering to my mom at one point, and she looked nervous. My aunts kept glancing at me like they were waiting for the right moment to say something. Then finally, it happened. My uncle, who had been acting as the unofficial host of the evening, stood up and called for everyone's attention. He gave some speech about how it was time to put the past behind us and how we all needed to move forward as a family. And then, with a big smile, he turned to me and said, "There's just one little thing we'd like you to do for us." A thick envelope was placed in front of me. I didn't even have to open it to know what this was about. The envelope sat in front of me, thick and heavy, like it carried the weight of something I was definitely not going to like. My uncle, the one who had been leading the whole family reunion act, had that kind of fake rehearsed smile that made it clear he thought this was already a done deal. I didn't touch the envelope right away. Instead, I let my eyes scan the room. That's when I noticed him, a man in a suit, sitting quietly at the far end of the table. He wasn't eating, wasn't chatting, just observing. A lawyer. They had brought a lawyer. That's when everything clicked. The over-the-top welcome, the forced nostalgia, the constant talk about forgiveness and family unity. This entire night had been a setup. I finally picked up the envelope and flipped it open. Multiple pages, all printed on official-looking paper, full of dense legal language. My best friend, who was still playing the role of my casual plus one, leaned over slightly to get a look. His expression didn't change, but I could tell he was already working out what this was. Then came the explanation. My uncles, aunts, and even a few cousins chimed in, making it sound like this was some grand, noble effort, a fair redistribution of my father's estate. According to them, my dad had been emotionally manipulated into favoring me in his will. They painted it like I had somehow tricked him, like I had brainwashed him into giving me the house and the majority of the money. And now, they were asking, no expecting, me to sign a document that would correct his mistake. The language they used was carefully chosen. They framed it as a way to bring the family back together. Signing would prove I wasn't selfish. It would show that I valued love over money. That I wasn't, as my uncle put it, one of those greedy types who let money ruin family bonds. Then came the real blow. My mother. She had been quiet through most of this, but when I turned to her, she didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked guilty. That's when she admitted it. She had known about this plan. She hadn't just known. She had encouraged it. She said she truly believed this was best for everyone, that this was a way to heal the wounds in the family, that she had hoped I would understand and do the right thing. I didn't say anything, not yet. Instead, I handed the papers to my friend, my +1, and let him do what he did best. While he flipped through the pages, the family's lawyer, who had been sitting quietly up until now, finally spoke up. He said this wouldn't take long, that everything had already been reviewed, that this was just a formality. I was still silent, but I wasn't stupid. If it were just a formality, they wouldn't have needed to ambush me like this. My friend finished skimming the first few pages, then casually flipped to the back. His hand stilled. He didn't look at me, didn't react, but I saw the way his grip on the paper tightened for just a second before he placed the document back in front of me and tapped a section with his finger. I glanced down, and there it was. The house, the one thing my father made sure would be mine, the thing my family had been bitter about for years, was the centerpiece of this so-called redistribution. Buried in the legal jargon was a clause that would transfer the house deed into a newly formed family trust, a trust controlled entirely by my uncles. I let the room sit in silence for a moment, then finally spoke. I asked them calmly if they really expected me to give up my home just because they thought it was unfair they didn't get more. The reaction was immediate. My uncle scoffed, another called me ungrateful, and a cousin chimed in about how we all contributed to raising you, so we all deserve a share. I stayed seated. I didn't raise my voice. I just stated the obvious. This wasn't about fairness, it was about greed. That's when the threats started. If I didn't sign, they'd challenge the will in court. They'd drag this out. They'd make my life miserable. I glanced at my friend, who barely even looked up as he reached into his jacket and pulled out a pen. He tapped it against the table and simply said, "Go ahead. But if you're going to threaten a lawsuit, be ready for one in return." Silence. The lawyer at the end of the table shifted uncomfortably. That was the moment they realized this wasn't going to be easy. I stood up, taking the documents with me. That's when my mother, who had stayed quiet through most of the arguing, finally spoke again. She followed me to the door, voice softer now, saying they just wanted what's best for everyone. I turned to her, looked her straight in the eye, and told her the truth. No, you wanted what's best for them. And then I walked out. By the time I got home, I already knew what was coming. My phone was blowing up with missed calls from my mother, a few texts from distant cousins pretending to check in, and one very aggressive voicemail from my uncle. I ignored all of it. The only person I needed to talk to was sitting right next to me. My best friend, who also happened to be a lawyer. We sat down and went through the documents line by line. The more we read, the worse it got. The house transfer was just the tip of the iceberg. The whole thing was designed to strip me of control over my inheritance. The fine print included a clause stating that I would be voluntarily relinquishing any legal claim to my father's estate in exchange for a family-directed redistribution process. Translation? Once I signed, I had no say in what happened to the money. Another section outlined a trustee council, a group made up of my uncles and aunts, who would oversee the funds and decide where they should go. They weren't just asking for a share, they wanted everything. That's when my friend started drafting something of his own. Instead of ignoring them, we were going to give them a counteroffer, one they couldn't weasel their way out of. A legal document stating that if anyone in the family ever contested the will again, they would immediately forfeit any remaining claim to the estate. No loopholes. No second chances. Once it was finalized, I made a call. My mother picked up instantly. Before she could start in with the apologies or excuses, I told her I'd meet with the family again, but on my terms. No surprises. No ambushes. And this time, I wouldn't be coming alone. 2 days later, I arrived at my uncle's house, but I wasn't walking in blind. My best friend was with me again, but this time we had backup, an estate attorney who specialized in cases just like this. The moment we walked in, I could tell they weren't expecting this. The fake warmth from the last meeting was gone. My uncle's smile was tighter. A few cousins whispered to each other as I took my seat. My mother looked nervous, but she wasn't the only one. I placed my counteroffer on the table. Then my lawyer pulled out their original document and went straight to the worst parts. He didn't sugarcoat it, he laid it all out. The house grab, the total financial control, the ridiculous trustee group. The more he talked, the more uncomfortable everyone looked. My uncle, who had been the one leading this whole thing, suddenly started backpedaling. He called it a miscommunication, a misunderstanding. He acted like he hadn't personally brought a lawyer to pressure me into signing. I wasn't interested in excuses. I put my counteroffer on the table and told them this was their choice now. Option 1. Sign the document, agree to never challenge my father's will again, and this whole thing ends today. Option 2. Try to fight it, and I would take legal action for attempted fraud. That's when the real meltdown started. The room exploded. My uncle started yelling about how I was tearing the family apart. Another relative threw in something about how no one in this family should be bringing in outside lawyers. My mother was crying. A cousin accused me of treating my inheritance like a business deal instead of a family matter. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just sat there while they unraveled. Eventually, my uncle demanded to see a copy of the new document. He scanned it, then immediately tried to nitpick. He said it was unnecessary and too aggressive. I told him that if he had nothing to hide, signing it shouldn't be a problem. They refused. One by one, my relatives shot it down. Not because it was unfair, but because it took away their ability to pull this stunt again later. That's when my mother finally cracked. Through the chaos, she admitted it. She had been pressured into siding with them. They told her this was for the good of the family, that if she didn't convince me to sign, she would be cut off too. She turned to them and asked if that was true. No one answered. The silence said it all. That was the moment she realized exactly what they had done. I stood up, told them they had their chance. I had played fair, given them a way out, and they had thrown it away. I warned them if they ever tried to come after my inheritance again, I wouldn't just fight back. I'd bury them in legal trouble. And then I left. That night, I made a post on a legal advice forum, leaving out identifying details but explaining the situation. The responses were unanimous. Secure everything. Lock down the house. Move assets. Prepare for any kind of retaliation. At first, I thought they would give up. The lawsuit was dead. The truth was out, and even my mother had distanced herself from them. But toxic families don't just stop. They find new ways to manipulate. My uncle started pushing a reconciliations narrative, spinning the story to make it seem like I was the one unwilling to make peace. He tried to guilt relatives into taking his side again, but this time, fewer people were listening. Word got back to me that my uncle was already looking for a new lawyer. He still wanted to challenge the will, but according to one of my cousins, his own legal team told him it was a losing battle. Not that it stopped him from trying. The silence didn't last long. Less than 24 hours after I shut down my uncle's scheme, the smear campaign started. It began with messages. Aunts, uncles, cousins, some I hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly found my number. Every text followed the same pattern: how disappointed they were, how selfish I had become, how I was tearing the family apart over money. Some were subtle, trying to guilt-trip me into reconsidering. Others went straight for the insults, calling me ungrateful and accusing me of ruining my father's legacy. I blocked most of them, but the real damage wasn't happening in private. It was happening online. My cousin tipped me off. The family was airing everything on Facebook. Suddenly, my uncle had a new version of events. According to him, I had manipulated my father into rewriting the will, cutting the rest of the family out. He made it sound like my dad had been frail and confused, and that I had somehow convinced him to rob his own siblings. The posts weren't directly naming me, but they didn't have to. Anyone who knew the situation could figure out who they were talking about. Comments flooded in. Some relatives jumped in to agree, adding their own stories about how I had always been selfish. Others played peacemaker, urging family unity. A few distant family friends even chimed in, completely clueless, saying how heartbreaking it was to see money tear a family apart. It was a full-blown PR attack, and my mother was caught in the middle. She called me, crying. The pressure was getting to her. My uncle and his siblings were hounding her non-stop, telling her she had failed as a mother by letting me turn my back on the family. She begged me to just talk to them again and find a compromise. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I just told her one thing: look at what they're doing. If this was really about family, why were they dragging my father's name through the mud? Why were they lying about him being manipulated when he had been completely in control of his choices? And most importantly, why was their first reaction to lose their minds online, instead of having an actual conversation? She didn't have an answer. I cut off the conversation and started clearing house. I went through my social media and locked everything down. Anyone who had shared or commented on my uncle's lies got blocked. I made sure mutual friends knew exactly what was going on so that I could keep tabs without directly engaging. I wasn't going to play into their drama. That's when I got an unexpected message. An old friend of my father's reached out, someone who had known him for decades, someone my uncle clearly didn't realize was watching all of this unfold. He had one question: do you know how bad your uncle's finances are? I didn't, but I was about to find out. According to my dad's friend, my uncle's business had been bleeding money for years. Failed investments, unpaid debts, legal disputes. He had been drowning for a while, but he had managed to keep it quiet. The inheritance grab, it wasn't just greed, it was desperation. I started digging. It didn't take long to confirm everything. My uncle had multiple lawsuits against him from former business partners. Some creditors had already taken legal action. He was this close to losing everything. And then, right on cue, the legal threats arrived. I received a letter from a lawyer claiming that my family intended to challenge the will in court. Their argument: undue influence. The exact lie my uncle had been spreading online. I didn't panic. I sent it straight to my lawyer. He barely even blinked at it. My father's will had been legally airtight. The accusations had zero proof. The case would be laughed out of court, but we weren't just going to dismiss it. We were going to hit back. My lawyer sent a response. Any attempt to drag this into court would result in a countersuit for legal fees and damages. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. A few days later, I got another update from my cousin. My uncle was panicking. His plan wasn't working. His own lawyer had apparently warned him that this was a losing case. But after his legal strategy failed, my uncle changed tactics. He started whispering to family members, floating the idea that I could be blackmailed or pressured another way. He even hinted at taking this to the media, hoping public pressure would force me to do the right thing. But no one was biting anymore. He started pressuring other relatives, ones who had nothing to do with the inheritance, to lend him money. He used the same sob story, claiming I had stolen what was rightfully theirs, and that if they helped him fix it, he'd make sure they all got a fair share. It wasn't working. More family members were starting to see through the act. Some of them had defended him at first, but now they were realizing they had backed the wrong side. Even my mother was wavering. After seeing how vicious my uncle had been, after watching the lies he was spreading, she was starting to question everything. Then came the final straw. A distant relative, someone who had been neutral in all of this, contacted me. They had proof that my uncle had been planning this for months. Screenshots, emails, messages between family members where my uncle had been openly discussing how to take the house from me. This wasn't some emotional last-minute family dispute. This wasn't about fairness. This was a calculated plan. And if they wanted a legal battle, I was about to give them one. It didn't take long for my uncle to make his next move. Less than a week after his online smear campaign and failed attempts to rally the family, I was officially served with legal documents. His lawyer had filed a case contesting my father's will, claiming undue influence. The argument that I had somehow manipulated my father into changing the will before he passed, cutting out the rest of the family. The documents were vague, full of emotional language, but lacking any real proof. My lawyer took one look at them, exhaled through his nose like he was bored, and started drafting our motion to dismiss. Within days, my legal team filed a strong response, citing lack of evidence and frivolous intent. My lawyer warned me that while the case had no real standing, inheritance disputes had a way of dragging out. They might not win, he said, but they'll try to wear you down. I braced myself for a prolonged fight. The will had been drafted and finalized years before my father passed, with all legal protocols followed. My uncle had no case, no standing, and no real argument. Just a desperate attempt to strong-arm me into giving him what he wanted. Then, more dirt came out. My lawyer wasn't just preparing a defense, he was building a counterattack. He pulled records of past inheritance disputes my uncle had tried and failed to manipulate. He gathered witness statements, even from some of my cousins who were now willing to admit they had been pressured. The more evidence we compiled, the more airtight our case became. When my uncle's own lawyer saw what we had, he backed out. This wasn't the first time my uncle had tried legal loopholes to get money. Years ago, he had been involved in another inheritance dispute, trying to contest an estate from a distant relative. The case never made it far, but the pattern was clear. He had a history of attempting to legally manipulate wills when he felt entitled to more than he received, and then came the real turning point. A key witness stepped forward. My father's longtime lawyer reached out, offering to testify that my father had full mental capacity when he finalized the will. He confirmed that my father had deliberately chosen to leave the majority of his estate to me, that there had been zero outside pressure, and that my uncle had never been promised a single thing. With that, my uncle's case started falling apart. Cousins began turning on him. A few of my more neutral cousins, ones who had stayed quiet in the beginning, started distancing themselves. They saw the lawsuit for what it was, a desperate cash grab. Some even admitted they regretted believing his lies. But the real nail in the coffin, leaked family texts. One of my cousins, who had been sitting on the fence, secretly sent me screenshots from the extended family group chat. And those messages, they were gold. They showed exactly how long my uncle had been planning this. The messages went back months, detailing how my uncle had orchestrated the family reunion just to pressure me into signing away my inheritance. There were discussions about how to guilt me, how to get my mother on their side, and even comments from other family members mocking me for being too soft to fight back. My lawyer didn't hesitate. We countersued for legal fees and damages. That was the breaking point. Within days, my uncle's own lawyer backed out of the case. It was clear this was a lost cause, and no reputable lawyer wanted to attach their name to a lawsuit that was about to implode. That's when the family panic started. Relatives who had originally sided with my uncle started backtracking. Suddenly, I was getting messages from family members begging me to drop everything before it got worse. They claimed the whole thing had been a misunderstanding, and that family shouldn't be fighting over money. I ignored every single one. Then came the moment my mother finally made her choice. After weeks of being caught in the middle, she finally saw everything for what it was. The leaked messages, the lies, the manipulation. It was too much. She told my uncle and the rest of the family that she was done. She cut ties. With my uncle losing his legal backing and my mother fully on my side, the case completely collapsed. With no lawyer and no real evidence, my uncle had no choice but to drop the lawsuit. But of course, he couldn't just admit defeat. He started telling anyone who would listen that he had chosen to let it go because he didn't want to tear the family apart. No one bought it. The damage was already done. Word spread through our community about the failed lawsuit. His reputation tanked. People started distancing themselves from him, seeing him for what he truly was. And then, his final attempt at manipulation. He called me one last time. This time there was no yelling, no legal threats, just a quiet, pathetic attempt to salvage something from this mess. He asked for just a small portion of the inheritance. Not all of it, just something to help him get back on his feet. I didn't hesitate. You tried to steal from me. Now you get nothing. And then I hung up. With the lawsuit dead and my uncle publicly humiliated, I figured things would finally quiet down. But as it turned out, karma wasn't done with him yet. A few weeks after the failed legal battle, a family friend casually mentioned something that caught my attention. My uncle was in serious financial distress. Apparently, he wasn't just struggling, he was drowning. Between his failing business, the money he had wasted on legal fees, and the debts he had been hiding for years, he was running out of options. Rumors started circulating that he might have to declare bankruptcy, and just like that, the relatives who once backed him, the ones who had called me selfish, accused me of tearing the family apart, started disappearing. They weren't defending him anymore. They weren't checking in on him. They were avoiding him, because without my inheritance as a potential payday, they had no reason to stick around. The family turned on itself. At first, my uncle had been the ringleader, convincing everyone that they deserved a share of my father's estate. But now, the infighting had started. With no money coming their way, the same relatives who had been so united against me began turning on each other. Some accused my uncle of handling it wrong. Others started whispering about where his own money had gone. A few even suggested that he should have just negotiated with me instead of trying to take everything. It was chaos, and I had nothing to do with it. That was the biggest win. With the case officially dropped, there were no further legal challenges to my inheritance. The house, my father's house, was legally and permanently mine. No more threats, no more shady documents, no more surprise family reunions. I had secured everything, and there was nothing they could do about it. But my uncle wasn't done embarrassing himself. After losing the lawsuit, he started begging for money. First, he reached out to other relatives, spinning some story about how he had been wronged and just needed a little help to get back on his feet. No one took the bait. Then, he went outside the family. He reached out to old friends, business contacts, anyone who might be willing to bail him out. Nothing. People knew what he had done. His reputation was tarnished. That's when he had one last meltdown online. A vague, bitter Facebook post about snakes in the family and how people show their true colors when money is involved. No one engaged. No one cared. It got a handful of pity likes from his last remaining supporters, mostly relatives who were just as bitter. That was it. No one was rushing to defend him. No one was taking his side anymore. His story was over. Then came the messages. A few cousins, the same ones who had backed my uncle at the start, started reaching out. Some were subtle, testing the waters with casual small talk. Others went straight for half-hearted apologies. They admitted they had been wrong about the whole situation, that they should have stayed out of it, that they were just going along with the family and hoped I wouldn't hold a grudge. I didn't respond. I wasn't interested in fake apologies from people who only realized their mistake after it cost them something. I cleaned house, blocked the last of the toxic family members from my phone, social media, everywhere. No more watching their drama unfold. No more indirect updates through mutuals. I was done. To celebrate, my girlfriend and I took a small vacation, something she had been suggesting for months. She had stood by me through all of this, reminding me to take care of myself even when the stress was overwhelming. It felt good to finally relax together. Something simple, just a weekend getaway, a break from all the chaos. It was exactly what my father would have encouraged. He had always told me that money wasn't about status or power. It was about freedom, about living life on your own terms. And that's exactly what I was doing now. I made one final Reddit update, not because I needed advice anymore, just because I still couldn't believe how far my family had gone just to try and take what wasn't theirs. It had started with a fake reunion. It escalated to manipulation, lies, legal threats, and a full-blown lawsuit. And now, everything had backfired. A month later, I got a text from a cousin. Nothing dramatic, just a single piece of gossip they thought I might find interesting. My uncle had sold his house. Not by choice. He needed the money. The same man who had tried to take my home had just lost his own. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I had already won. It didn't take long for the family group chat to implode. A cousin, one of the few who had stayed neutral, sent me screenshots of what was happening. My uncle, who had once convinced everyone that I was the villain, was now the one being torn apart. The same relatives who had backed him were turning on him. They were angry that they had been dragged into a losing battle. Some complained about how embarrassing it was to be part of such a public failure. Others blamed him for making them look stupid by feeding them false hope about winning the lawsuit. One message stood out. "You promised us we'd all get something. Now we're the ones stuck dealing with this mess while you ruined your own life." It was chaos. The same people who had been blindly following him were now piling on. The calls stopped. The messages dried up. Even the people who had defended him weren't answering his calls anymore. It was like he had become invisible overnight. A few cousins confirmed it. Most of the family was done with him. They realized they had been manipulated, and with his money problems now fully exposed, they wanted nothing to do with him. Without the promise of money, they had no reason to stay loyal. My mom struggled with guilt. She had spent so much time defending her brother, believing that he was just misguided instead of calculated. Now, seeing the extent of his lies, she was ashamed. She tried to apologize, but I didn't need one. She had already made her choice. She had cut ties with him, and that was enough. Slowly, she started to heal. She began reconnecting with old friends, people she had distanced herself from because she had been too wrapped up in family drama. For the first time in a long time, she was focusing on herself instead of trying to keep the peace. Then, the final blow came. A family friend passed along some news. My uncle's business was shutting down. It had been struggling for years, but after his failed lawsuit and the loss of his last remaining supporters, it couldn't survive. His reputation was in ruins. His finances were in shambles. And without the inheritance he had banked everything on, he had nothing left. That's when I got the email. A long, desperate message from my uncle, claiming to be a changed man. He regretted everything. He was going through a rough time. He just needed a little help to get back on his feet. A small loan, a fraction of what he tried to steal from me. I didn't even respond. I forwarded it straight to my lawyer, for documentation. I wasn't going to fall for it. With my uncle out of the picture, a few distant relatives suddenly tried to reconnect. Some pretended they had never taken sides. Others claimed they just wanted to move past everything and keep the family together. It was obvious why. They didn't want to admit they had been wrong. They just wanted to pretend nothing had happened, as if they hadn't spent months attacking me, backing my uncle's lies, and trying to take what wasn't theirs. I ignored them. I wasn't taking any more chances. I met with my lawyer again to fortify everything. We updated legal protections around my inheritance, ensuring that no loophole could ever be used to challenge it again. If anyone ever tried something like this in the future, they would instantly forfeit any claim. It was done. Final. Permanent. Then, one last betrayal came to light. One of my cousins, the same one who had pretended to be on my side, had been secretly feeding information back to my uncle. Every move I had made, every legal step I had taken, he had been reporting it. When I found out, I didn't even confront him. I just blocked him. No warnings, no explanations, just gone. The story spread fast. My uncle's failed lawsuit, his financial downfall, and his desperation became small-town gossip. People in his business circle distanced themselves. Old acquaintances wanted nothing to do with him. Then, one final piece of karma hit. He had one last chance to save his business, a deal he had been working on for months. It fell through. The other party had heard about his financial troubles and decided he was too much of a risk. It was over. With the family drama finally dead, my mom found peace. She no longer felt obligated to fix things. She stopped wasting energy on people who only took advantage of her kindness. For the first time in years, she was truly free. I thought back on everything. It started with a fake family reunion. It turned into an inheritance grab. It escalated into legal threats, public smears, and a full-blown lawsuit. And in the end, it backfired spectacularly. My uncle lost his business. He lost his credibility. He lost the family he manipulated. And me? I had everything I was meant to have. I was finally free. A year passed, and life had never been better. Without the constant stress of legal battles, manipulative relatives, and backstabbing family members, everything felt lighter. The house, once a symbol of all the chaos, finally felt like a home. I put time into fixing it up, making it my own, turning it into something my father would have been proud of. Work was thriving. My relationship was stronger than ever, and for the first time in years, I was moving forward without looking over my shoulder. No more threats. No more family drama. Just peace. Then, one day a distant cousin casually dropped some news. My uncle had finally gone bankrupt. It wasn't surprising. Between the lawsuits, the failed business, and the debts he had been juggling for years, there was no way he could have lasted much longer. He had officially lost everything. His family fell apart not long after. His wife, who had stuck around for years despite his reckless financial decisions, finally left. She took whatever assets were left and filed for divorce. Their kids, the same ones who had once treated me like an outsider, wanted nothing to do with him. No money meant no loyalty. The same man who had spent his life scheming, manipulating, and stepping over people to get ahead was now struggling to afford rent. He had spent so much time obsessing over my inheritance, convinced he deserved a piece of it, and now he had nothing. A few cousins reached out again, acting as if nothing had happened. Some apologized outright, admitting they had backed the wrong side. Others just sent casual messages, pretending like they had never been involved in the drama at all. I kept my distance. They had shown their true colors when it mattered, and I wasn't interested in rebuilding bridges that had already burned. My mother changed too. The weight of family expectations was finally off her shoulders, and she was living life on her own terms. For years, she had been trapped, always caught in the middle, always trying to keep the peace. Now, she was setting boundaries, traveling, doing things she had always talked about but never allowed herself to do. She had spent so long putting family before herself, but now she was free of that burden. With the last traces of family drama fading away, my girlfriend and I finally took a long overdue vacation. No distractions, no stress, just time to celebrate how far we had come. It was something my father would have encouraged. He had always believed in working hard but also taking time to enjoy life. Something I had forgotten in the middle of all the chaos. Even in his downfall, my uncle still tried one last time. A distant relative mentioned that he had been trying to find someone, anyone, who could talk some sense into me. But no one was listening anymore. His influence was gone, his supporters had abandoned him, and the family he had once controlled had crumbled around him. My lawyer confirmed what I already knew. My inheritance was legally untouchable. No one could challenge it again. All the loose ends were tied up, and there was no way anyone could try to pull another stunt in the future. It was over. The last thing I did was clean house for good. I removed every last toxic family member from my life, the ones who had plotted against me, the ones who had spread lies, the ones who had only reached out when they thought they could gain something. It was final. No second chances. No lingering connections. Just done. Surprisingly, a few distant relatives, ones who had stayed out of the drama, sent quiet messages of support. They never got involved, but they had watched it all unfold, and they wanted me to know they respected how I handled everything. Occasionally, I'd think about what could have been. What if my family hadn't been so greedy? What if they had just accepted my father's wishes and moved on? Could things have been different? Maybe. But I didn't dwell on it for long. Some people couldn't help themselves. If it hadn't been the inheritance, it would have been something else. Instead of wasting time on what-ifs, I decided to honor my father's legacy in a way that mattered. He had always believed in giving back, so I donated to some of the causes he supported. It felt right. The money wasn't just a symbol of what he left behind. It was a way to make sure his impact carried on. With everything settled, the toxic people gone, and my future finally in my own hands, I knew one thing for sure. Life was finally mine. A strange email arrived in my inbox. It wasn't from a cousin trying to reconnect, or an old relative hoping to smooth things over. It was from my uncle's ex-wife, the woman who had left him after his life completely fell apart. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. The message was direct. She had something I needed to see. Attached were screenshots, old messages, conversations that went back years. And as I read through them, I realized something shocking. My uncle's plan to take my inheritance didn't start after my father died. He had been planning this for a long time. In the messages, he and a few other family members had plotted ways to manipulate my mother into signing over assets, long before my father even passed away. They had gone back and forth about different strategies, convincing her it would be in the family's best interest, making her believe my father would have wanted it, even finding ways to put her in a position where she had no choice. And then came the most insane revelation. At one point, my uncle had even suggested trying to convince my father to legally adopt one of his kids. That way, his child would have a direct legal claim to the inheritance. I sat there staring at the proof. This wasn't just about greed, this was a long-running scheme. He had spent years thinking about how to take what wasn't his, and in the end he got nothing. My lawyer's response was simple: keep everything on file. If my uncle ever tried anything again, I had the proof to shut it down immediately. But at this point, he wasn't in a position to do much of anything. A cousin confirmed what I already suspected. My uncle was completely broke and still bitter. He had lost his house, his business, his family, and the respect of everyone around him. Now he had nothing left except a sad little story. He spent his time ranting about me at family gatherings, blaming me for everything that had happened. He told anyone who would listen that I was the one who destroyed everything. But here's the thing, no one was listening anymore. Even the few family members who had once defended him had gotten tired of his nonsense. They realized that no amount of complaining would change the fact that he did this to himself. One night, my mother and I had a conversation about it all. She wondered how different things could have been if she had cut off her brother sooner, if she had never tried to keep the family together, if she had never let them pressure her into believing they deserved more than what they had. But there was no point in dwelling on what-ifs. Instead, I decided to start something new. For years, family gatherings had been nothing but stress, manipulation, and fake smiles. Now, I had the chance to create my own traditions. I started spending more time with the people who actually cared about me. Close friends, my girlfriend, my mom, the people who mattered. Then came my uncle's last desperate move. With no job, no house, and no money, he did what so many bitter people do. He started a GoFundMe. The description? He claimed he had been betrayed by his own family, that greedy relatives had taken everything from him, and now he was struggling just to survive. The donations? Almost non-existent. A few relatives who still felt bad for him sent small amounts. But the goal? Nowhere near met. No one cared, and that was the ultimate revenge. I never had to do anything extreme. I never had to destroy him. He destroyed himself. One night, my girlfriend pointed something out. If none of this had happened, I might have always second-guessed myself. I might have held on to toxic family connections, kept giving people chances they didn't deserve, and spent years looking over my shoulder wondering if someone was going to come after my inheritance again. Now, I never had to worry about them again. I had my father's house. I had my inheritance. But most importantly, I had my peace. The last thing I did was post my final Reddit update. Not for advice, not to vent. Just to say this, no matter what happens, I won. I'm a 30-year-old guy, and I've been dating my girlfriend, Sarah 28F, for 2 years. Up until recently, everything was going great between us. We'd been talking about moving in together soon, and it felt like we were on the same page about our future. You know how sometimes you meet someone, and it just clicks? That's how it was with Sarah. We had the usual ups and downs, but nothing major. Or so I thought. Then, about a week ago, something weird happened. Sarah just disappeared. Like completely vanished. No calls, no texts, nothing on social media. It was out of character for her, and it threw me off completely. At first, I didn't panic. I figured maybe she needed some space or something came up that she'd explain later. Everyone needs a break sometimes, right? Day 1 passed, and I figured I'd give her some time. But when day 2 rolled around, I started getting a little nervous. She wasn't responding to any of my texts, and when I called, it went straight to voicemail. This wasn't like her. I tried to rationalize it, maybe her phone died, or she was caught up in something big at work. Still, it felt strange. By the third day, I was actively worried. I started reaching out to mutual friends to see if anyone had heard from her. But nope, everyone was just as clueless as I was. No one had seen her or talked to her since the last time we all hung out. I even tried calling her sister, but she hadn't heard from her either. At this point, I was really starting to panic. I went by her apartment to check if she was home, but there was no sign of her. Her car wasn't in the parking lot, and the lights were off. Her mailbox was full of unread mail too, which made things even more concerning. I stopped by her workplace to ask if they had seen her, but they told me she hadn't been to work for the past few days. I was officially freaking out. My friends tried to reassure me, telling me to relax and not assume the worst. But as the days went by with no word from her, I couldn't help but imagine all sorts of horrible scenarios. What if she had been in an accident? What if something worse had happened? It was the not knowing that really got to me. On the fifth day, I decided enough was enough and went to the police to file a missing person report. I explained everything to them. How Sarah had just disappeared, no contact, no signs of where she might be. They took my statement and said they'd look into it, but honestly, they didn't seem too optimistic. I guess people go off the grid more often than I realized, but this didn't feel right at all. During this time, I barely slept. I kept having these nightmares where I'd find her in some terrible situation or see her in danger, and I'd wake up drenched in sweat. My anxiety was through the roof. I even tried to track her phone, but it was turned off the day she vanished, which was just another dead end. Meanwhile, some of my friends started pulling away. They told me I was getting too obsessed with finding her and that maybe she had just ghosted me. That thought hadn't even crossed my mind before, but once they said it, it stuck. Had she really just up and left me? It didn't make sense. But then again, what about this situation did? I started looking back at the last few weeks, trying to figure out if I'd missed any signs. Were there moments when she seemed distant? Was she unhappy? And I didn't notice? I kept replaying our last conversations in my head, trying to pinpoint if I had done something wrong. It was like I was searching for a reason, any reason, for why she would leave like this. Then, exactly 1 week after she disappeared, Sarah showed up at my door. It was late, around midnight, and I almost didn't hear the knock. When I opened the door, there she was, standing there looking completely disheveled, like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was messy, her clothes were wrinkled, and there were dark circles under her eyes. But that wasn't the weirdest part. She wasn't alone. There was a little boy with her, maybe 4 years old, holding onto her hand tightly. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, looking at me like she was expecting me to know what was going on. I didn't. I was speechless. Finally, she broke the silence. "This is Timmy," she said, motioning to the child. I just stared at her, my mind racing. Timmy? Who was Timmy? Where had she been? Why hadn't she called? A million questions ran through my head, but before I could ask anything, she stopped me. "I can't explain everything right now," she said. "We need to talk, but not tonight." That was it. No explanations, no answers, just a vague promise of a conversation that still hadn't happened. I stood there, confused, watching as she walked inside with this kid in tow, like nothing out of the ordinary had happened. And that's where I'm at now, stuck in a situation I don't understand, with no idea what's going on or what's coming next. Update 1. After that bizarre night when Sarah returned with Timmy, things only got more confusing. Over the next few days, I tried to get some answers, but it was like hitting a wall. Every time I brought up where she'd been or why she suddenly had a kid with her, she'd brush me off. "We'll talk soon," she'd say, but soon never came. She kept insisting we should just focus on the present, but that wasn't sitting right with me. There was too much going on for me to just let it slide. Meanwhile, Timmy never left her side. This kid was glued to her, like he was afraid to let go. He wouldn't talk, not even a word. It was strange. I tried asking him questions, thinking maybe he'd open up, but nothing. He'd just look at Sarah, almost like he was asking for permission to speak, but then he'd stay silent. His behavior wasn't like any kid I'd ever met. Days passed, and my frustration grew. I couldn't ignore the situation anymore. Friends started reaching out, asking if I'd gotten any answers. Some were supportive, but others were more blunt, telling me I needed to demand answers or just walk away. But it wasn't that simple. I didn't know how to approach this without things spiraling out of control. One night, things got weirder. I started noticing that Sarah was acting differently. She'd be whispering on the phone late at night, talking in hushed tones, and when I'd ask who she was talking to, she'd change the subject or say it was nothing. And then there were the nights when she'd leave the apartment with Timmy, saying she had to run an errand. She'd be gone for hours, and when I asked where she went, she'd give vague answers like, just running some personal stuff. It wasn't adding up. About a week after she'd come back, I hit my breaking point. We were having dinner, and the tension in the room was thick. I couldn't take it anymore, so I confronted her. I asked her directly where she had been, why she hadn't told me about Timmy, and what was really going on. Instead of giving me answers, she broke down crying. But even in tears, she wouldn't explain. She just kept saying she was sorry, but it's complicated. That was the moment I realized I wasn't going to get any real answers unless I did some digging myself. After dinner, when she and Timmy had gone to bed, I decided to do a little background check. We'd been together for 2 years, and not once had she mentioned a child, let alone had any photos or posts about Timmy. It didn't take long to figure out that Timmy wasn't hers. There was no record of her ever having a kid. No birth announcements, no hospital records, nothing. So who was this kid? At this point, I started considering some wild possibilities. Was Timmy the result of a previous relationship she'd never told me about? Was she hiding some part of her past? I was beginning to doubt everything I thought I knew about Sarah. The more I thought about it, the more paranoid I got. What else could she be hiding from me? A couple of days later, I finally got the truth, or at least part of it. Sarah came clean, but not without me practically dragging it out of her. She admitted that Timmy wasn't her son. He was her nephew. Apparently, her sister had gotten into some serious legal trouble and had to leave the country. In a panic, she left Timmy with Sarah without much notice. Sarah didn't know what to do and had been trying to figure it out on her own. She didn't tell me because she was scared I'd judge her family, or worse, that I'd leave her over the chaos. Hearing all of this, I felt conflicted. On the one hand, I understood why she was afraid to tell me. But on the other hand, it didn't change the fact that she kept me in the dark for so long. It felt like a betrayal. For weeks, I'd been worrying, losing sleep, and stressing out, all because she couldn't be honest with me. She was terrified of losing me, but by hiding the truth, she was pushing me away even more. The worst part was, Sarah didn't have the financial means to take care of Timmy full-time. Her sister had left her in a mess, and now Sarah was the one dealing with all of it. She admitted that she didn't know how to handle the situation, and she wasn't sure if she could keep taking care of him. The stress was wearing on her, and I could see it. But now I had to ask myself, was I willing to stay in this relationship, knowing all the secrets she'd kept? Was I ready to take on a child I never agreed to care for? I didn't have the answers. I didn't know what to do, so I turned to Reddit. I posted about everything that had happened, laying it all out and asking for advice. The responses were mixed. Some people told me to run, to leave the relationship because the lies were too much. Others said I should stay, that Sarah was going through a tough time and needed my support. It left me more confused than before. I didn't know what the right move was, but I knew I couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. Update 2. After everything that had gone down, I needed some space. Sarah's confession about her sister and Timmy left me feeling more confused than ever. I didn't know what to do, and staying in the apartment with them wasn't helping. So, I decided to temporarily move out. I told Sarah I needed time to think, but I promised I'd still support her emotionally while I figured things out. I didn't just want to disappear like she had, but I also couldn't stay in the middle of this chaos. It didn't take long before things got worse. While I was staying at a friend's place, Sarah called me to say that the authorities had contacted her about her sister's legal trouble. Apparently, things were more serious than she'd let on. Her sister was in deeper with the law, and now there was a chance Sarah might get pulled into it if she didn't cooperate. I could hear the fear in her voice. She was trying to stay strong, but it was clear she didn't know how to handle it. Even though I was still angry with her for keeping me in the dark, I knew I couldn't just leave her to deal with this alone. I told her I'd help her through the legal process, but I set a hard boundary: I wouldn't take responsibility for Timmy. I didn't know what was going to happen with her sister, but I couldn't take on a child when everything felt so uncertain. She agreed, but something about the whole situation still didn't sit right with me. The more I thought about it, the more doubts I had. Was Sarah telling me everything about her sister? What if there was more to the story that she wasn't sharing? I started wondering if her sister was even the real problem. Could Sarah be involved in something I didn't know about? I didn't want to believe it, but at this point I wasn't sure what to think. Things took another unexpected turn a few nights later. I was still at my friend's place when Sarah called me, panicked. Timmy's biological father, her sister's ex-boyfriend, had shown up at the apartment, demanding custody of Timmy. He claimed he was Timmy's real dad, and that Sarah had no right to keep him. From what she told me, the guy was furious, and the situation was escalating fast. I rushed back to the apartment, and when I got there, the tension was thick. Sarah and this guy were in a full-blown shouting match, both of them claiming to have Timmy's best interests at heart. Meanwhile, Timmy was clinging to Sarah, scared and confused. I didn't know what to believe. This guy seemed like he could be telling the truth, but Sarah was adamant that her sister had left Timmy in her care for a reason. Things got even more heated when the ex-boyfriend threatened to take Timmy by force. That's when someone, probably a neighbor, called Child Protective Services CPS. They showed up not long after and opened an investigation into the living situation. They wanted to know if Timmy was in a safe environment and what the actual custody arrangement was. That night, Sarah finally broke down. With CPS now involved, she couldn't keep up the lies anymore. She confessed that she had been hiding more from me than just her sister's troubles. She admitted she had lied about several things, including her own involvement in her sister's illegal activities. It turns out she'd been helping her sister financially for months, using money that she'd been borrowing from me under false pretenses. She told me the money was for rent and bills, but it was actually going to her sister. I felt sick. This wasn't just a messy situation with her sister anymore, it was my financial stability that was at risk too. I realized how much money I had poured into this relationship, all the while being lied to. Sarah's actions had taken a serious toll on me, not just emotionally but financially. I felt completely used. After that night, I started to pull back even more. Friends reached out, telling me I needed to get out of this situation before it dragged me down further. They were right. Trust was broken completely. I couldn't believe anything Sarah had told me anymore, and every time I tried to move past it, something else came up. The lies just kept piling up. I decided to meet with a lawyer to protect myself. I didn't know what legal trouble Sarah might be involved in, but I didn't want to get caught up in it. I had to make sure my finances and future weren't tied to hers in any way. The lawyer told me it was smart to separate myself financially and legally as much as possible. The advice hit me hard. This wasn't just a rough patch in a relationship, this was a full-blown disaster I had to get out of. Despite everything, Sarah apologized. She told me she'd do whatever it took to make things right, but I didn't know if that was even possible at this point. The damage was done, and I didn't know how to fix it. I felt like I had to choose between someone I loved and my own well-being. Once again, I turned to Reddit. I updated my post, laying out everything that had happened, the lies, the financial strain, the involvement of CPS, and my doubts about staying in the relationship. I didn't know what to do anymore, and I needed advice. Just like before, the responses were divided. Some people told me to run, that Sarah's lies were too much to overcome. Others said I should stay, that she was going through a tough time and needed my support. I felt torn. I still loved her, but could I really stay in a relationship built on so many lies? The future looked uncertain, and I didn't know if I could trust her again. All I knew was that something had to change, and soon. Update 3. After CPS got involved, things took a turn I hadn't expected. The investigation into Timmy's living situation started almost immediately, and that's when it hit me. This wasn't just a mess Sarah had to deal with. It could affect me too. CPS was asking questions about the home environment, finances, and whether or not Timmy was in safe hands. With me technically living there before I moved out, I started realizing this could have long-term consequences on my life and reputation. I wasn't just some bystander anymore. I was in the middle of this mess, and I didn't even sign up for it. The stress was wearing me down. Every day felt like a new challenge, a new lie, or another layer to the situation. I wasn't sleeping, and my work started slipping. Between worrying about CPS, Sarah's sister's legal issues, and how much I'd been lied to, I was exhausted. Emotionally, physically, financially, I was drained. It felt like I was carrying a weight that wasn't even mine to begin with. That's when my friends stepped in. I hadn't realized just how bad things had gotten until they sat me down and staged an intervention. They told me straight up I needed to leave. They'd seen how this situation was tearing me apart and thought I'd been manipulated for too long. One of my closest friends even said he didn't recognize me anymore. They could see how much I'd sacrificed, but for what? Lies and manipulation? They weren't wrong. The problem was, I still didn't know if I could walk away. I loved Sarah, or at least the version of her I thought I knew. Meanwhile, Sarah's behavior had become more desperate. She begged me not to leave her, claiming she would lose everything if I walked away. She made it sound like I was her last lifeline. At one point, she even broke down, saying Timmy's future was at risk. CPS had warned us that if her sister didn't come forward soon, Timmy might end up in foster care. That hit me hard. Despite everything, I'd grown attached to the kid. He didn't deserve any of this, but at the same time, I had to think about my own future. Then, the legal trouble got even deeper. Sarah's sister's case was getting worse, and now Sarah herself was named as a person of interest. It seemed like every day there was a new development that dragged us further into this mess. I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah still wasn't telling me the whole story. I started noticing inconsistencies in what she'd said about her sister and Timmy. It was small stuff at first, little details that didn't add up. But the more I thought about it, the more I questioned everything she'd told me. Things took a darker turn when Sarah started using emotional blackmail. She implied that if I left, she didn't know what she'd do, even suggesting she might harm herself. That scared me. I didn't want to abandon her if she was in that kind of mental state, but I also knew it was manipulative. She was trying to make me stay out of guilt and fear, not because it was the right thing to do. I couldn't keep going like this. I made a tough decision. I cut off all financial support. I told her that from now on, she was on her own. I wasn't going to keep bailing her out, especially when I didn't even know the full truth. That led to one of the biggest fights we'd ever had. She accused me of abandoning her in her darkest hour, saying I didn't care about her or Timmy. I couldn't hold back anymore. I told her I felt betrayed by all the lies and deception. She had kept me in the dark for months, and now I was supposed to just forgive and forget. And then, out of nowhere, Sarah packed a bag and left. She took Timmy with her and didn't tell me where they were going. She cut off all contact, didn't respond to my calls or texts, and just disappeared again. This time, though, it wasn't just her vanishing, it was her and Timmy, and I had no idea if they were safe or what her plan was. I was left panicking. After everything we'd been through, she was gone again, but this time with a child who had no idea what was happening. Days went by, and I heard nothing. I was torn between relief that she was gone and worry about Timmy's well-being. What if something happened to them? What if she wasn't stable enough to take care of him? I felt powerless. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I got a call from a lawyer. Sarah was considering legal action against me for emotional distress. Apparently, she was claiming that I had caused her so much emotional harm that she was going to sue me. It felt like another blow after everything I had already endured. How could she do this after everything I'd done to support her? I didn't know what to do, so I went back to Reddit. I updated my post, explaining everything that had happened, Sarah's sudden disappearance, Timmy's involvement, the emotional blackmail, and now the legal threat. I asked for advice on how to protect myself from these allegations. I was desperate for some kind of direction because, at this point, I was completely lost. The responses started pouring in, and once again, people were divided. Some told me to lawyer up immediately and cut all ties. Others sympathized with Sarah, saying she was clearly struggling with mental health issues and that I should try to help her get the support she needed. I didn't know who to listen to. All I knew was that I couldn't go on like this. Something had to give, but I didn't know what the next step was. Update 4. After everything, the advice I got from Reddit was unanimous: file a restraining order. The situation had spiraled out of control, and I needed to protect myself from further manipulation and legal threats. So, I took the plunge and followed through. It wasn't easy, but I knew it had to be done. I filed for a restraining order against Sarah, and the legal process began. Finally, I felt like I was taking control of the situation, even though it left a bitter taste in my mouth. As much as I knew this was the right step, I couldn't shake the emotional turmoil. Part of me still cared about Sarah and, especially, Timmy. He was innocent in all of this, just a kid caught in a web of chaos that wasn't his fault. I couldn't stop thinking about where they were, if they were safe, or what the future held for Timmy. But I reminded myself that staying involved would only pull me deeper into a situation that wasn't good for anyone, especially me. Just as I was trying to process everything, CPS reached out again. They wanted a follow-up interview about Timmy's safety and living conditions, and I provided all the information I had. It was a tense conversation, and while I did my best to be cooperative, I was left feeling uncertain about what would happen next. CPS was still investigating, and the uncertainty was eating away at me. All I could do was wait for them to complete their case. Meanwhile, my lawyer dropped another bombshell. He warned me that Sarah might try to claim we had some kind of financial partnership, which could mean she'd demand compensation for shared living expenses. The fact that she was willing to go this far stunned me. We never had any formal financial arrangement, but it didn't seem to matter. This whole situation had become more about money and manipulation than I ever thought possible. I couldn't believe the lengths she was willing to go, even after disappearing with Timmy. But that wasn't the end of it. Sarah started making new claims, accusing me of knowing about her sister's illegal activities the entire time. She was trying to drag me into the legal trouble her family was facing. I was horrified. I had no idea about her sister's issues until Sarah confessed, and now she was trying to pin it on me. It felt like a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. To make matters worse, Sarah's family, people I had been close with for years, turned against me. They accused me of abandoning Sarah when she needed me the most, claiming I was heartless for walking away. It was like they didn't care about the lies, the manipulation, or the fact that I had been dragged into something I never agreed to. Suddenly, I was the bad guy in their eyes, and I felt completely isolated. The people who should have had my back were now blaming me for everything that went wrong. Then, a mutual friend dropped another bomb on me. According to them, Sarah had been planning to leave me long before Timmy entered the picture. She stayed in the relationship because she needed financial support, and I had unknowingly become her safety net. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. It confirmed everything I had feared, that I'd been manipulated the entire time. The relationship wasn't built on love or trust. It was based on convenience and financial dependence. That revelation crushed me. The stress, the lies, the manipulation, it all finally broke me down. I couldn't handle it anymore. I had a complete mental breakdown and knew I needed help. That's when I started therapy. I needed to process the trauma and confusion from the past few months, and therapy became my lifeline. It wasn't easy, but it was the only way to start piecing my life back together. Not long after, CPS updated me on Timmy's situation. They had placed him in temporary foster care while they continued their investigation. The news devastated me. Despite everything, I had grown attached to him. He was just a kid caught up in a terrible situation, and I couldn't help but feel responsible for what would happen to him. It was yet another layer of guilt and unresolved trauma that I had to process. As if things couldn't get worse, Sarah vanished again. She cut all ties with her family, friends, and me. No one knew where she had gone. It was like she disappeared off the face of the earth. I didn't know what to feel, relief that she was gone or worry that this was only temporary and she'd resurface with more chaos. Despite her disappearance, I felt a sense of closure creeping in. The immediate threat was gone, but there was still a lot of unresolved trauma, especially when it came to Timmy. He was the innocent one in all of this, and I couldn't help but feel guilty that I couldn't do more for him. But I had to remind myself that I wasn't responsible for everything that went wrong. I posted another update on Reddit, explaining the latest developments. To my surprise, my post blew up. The outpouring of sympathy and support from the community was overwhelming. People reassured me that I had made the right choice to protect myself and cut off contact with Sarah. They reminded me that none of this was my fault, and that I had been manipulated for too long. It was exactly what I needed to hear, and it helped me start to move on. Therapy continued to help, and slowly I began to feel better. I started to accept that I wasn't responsible for what happened, and that none of it was my fault. I had been manipulated, but I had taken control of the situation when it mattered most. Just when things seemed to calm down, another curveball hit. I got word that Sarah had been arrested in another state. The details were sketchy, but it was related to her sister's legal trouble. Update 5. So, this is going to be my final update, and honestly, it's a wild one. After everything that went down, I thought I'd finally gotten some peace. But then I found out that Sarah had been arrested. Yep, my ex was officially behind bars, and it was all tied back to her sister's criminal activities. I had heard rumors that her sister's legal troubles were getting worse, but I never imagined Sarah would get caught up in it like this. The news shocked me, but if I'm being real, there was a part of me that was relieved. It felt like this whole legal nightmare might finally be coming to an end. As soon as I found out about the arrest, I contacted my lawyer. He advised me to file for legal protection, just to make sure I wasn't implicated in any of her crimes. I couldn't take any chances after everything I'd been through. So I cooperated with the authorities, gave them whatever information I had, and made sure my name was clear. It was stressful, but at least I knew I was doing what I needed to protect myself. Not long after, CPS reached out to give me a final update on Timmy. They let me know that Timmy had been placed with a relative on Sarah's sister's side of the family. I can't lie. It was a bittersweet moment. I had grown attached to the little guy, even though all of this chaos wasn't his fault. But hearing that he was with family made me feel a sense of closure. I knew he was safe, and that's what mattered. I wasn't responsible for him, but I still hoped he would be okay. As the weeks passed, I felt myself slowly detaching from everything. Sarah, Timmy, the legal drama. For the first time in months, I started focusing on rebuilding my own life. I began reconnecting with friends I had drifted away from during the relationship. It was refreshing to hang out with people who weren't wrapped up in all the madness. They were relieved to see me getting back to normal, and honestly, it felt good to just have normal conversations again. No drama, no legal talk, just life. My family, who had been worried about me throughout the whole ordeal, also stepped in to help. They were supportive from day one, but now that things had settled down, they really helped me move forward. Whether it was just grabbing dinner or helping me with little things around the apartment, they made sure I wasn't isolated anymore. I could tell they were relieved that I was finally out of the situation for good. Therapy was a huge part of my recovery, too. It helped me process everything: the betrayal, the manipulation, and the loss. I hadn't realized just how deep the emotional toll had been until I started working through it with my therapist. Little by little, I started setting healthier boundaries in my relationships. I reflected on everything that had happened, and I realized how many red flags I had ignored because I was too invested in making the relationship work. I had been so focused on Sarah that I didn't see the damage it was doing to me. Months later, I got another piece of closure. Sarah had been sentenced to prison for her role in her sister's criminal enterprise. I didn't know how long she'd be in for, but the fact that there was a final resolution to her legal mess was a relief. It wasn't the ending I had ever imagined for her, but it made me realize just how much I had dodged a bullet by walking away. Despite all the pain, I had no regrets about leaving. It was the best decision I could have made for my mental health and my future. To wrap things up, I posted my final update on Reddit, thanking everyone for their advice and support. I didn't expect much, but the post went viral again. Thousands of people commented and upvoted, congratulating me for taking control of my life. It was surreal to see so many strangers rooting for me. The responses were overwhelmingly positive, and it felt like the perfect way to close this chapter of my life. With the legal issues behind me and Sarah out of the picture, I finally started to recover financially. I wasn't throwing money into a black hole anymore, and the weight of the past year lifted off my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. As part of my fresh start, I made the decision to sell my apartment and move to a new city. I wanted to leave behind all the painful memories of Sarah and the chaos she brought into my life. It was a chance to begin a new chapter, and I was excited about it. Moving on didn't mean forgetting everything, but it meant building something better for myself. Now, I've started dating again, but I'm being cautious. I'm prioritizing trust and honesty in my new relationships, making sure to set boundaries early on. It feels different this time. I'm stronger and wiser because of everything I've been through. I know what to look out for, and I won't settle for anything less than a relationship built on respect. Looking back, this past year was a whirlwind. I never imagined my life would take such a turn, but I'm grateful for the lessons it taught me. I'm leaving behind the drama and moving forward with hope for the future. I know I'm in a better place now, and that's what matters. Thanks to everyone who followed my journey. Your support helped me through the toughest time of my life. Here's to a new chapter, and hopefully a much quieter one.